The Beatles, the Audiostory by Thomas Bleskin. Read by Tony Sheridan.
The 6th of July 1957 is a thoroughly pleasant day in Liverpool. It's warm, a bit too muggy perhaps, and there are just a few clouds in the sky. There is a summer fete taking place in the small suburb of Woolton, and 17-year-old Ivan Vaughan is on his way there with a mate from the neighbouring suburb of Allerton. Ivan knows the singer and guitarist from the school band who are playing this afternoon really well, from the Quarry Bank High School for Boys. His friend, younger by 2 years, has often seen the charismatic frontman but never spoken to him before. The band plays a mixture of rock and roll, folk, jazz and country, known as skiffle. Ivan Vaughan knows that his young friend is a much more accomplished guitarist than the boy on the stage. He decides to introduce them. After the performance in front of St. Peter's Parish Church, the band leader listens to the chubby-cheeked 15-year-old's guitar skills on Ivan's advice, skeptically at first, until he gives his best renditions of Eddie Cochran's 20 Flight Rock and Bebopalula by Gene Vincent, with lyrics learnt by heart. It isn't an easy decision. The band leader, a known maverick, who today is wearing a simple checked shirt in place of his customary long jacket, knows that if he asks the talented left-hander to join his band, then his days as number one are numbered. On the other hand, John Winston Lennon is sure that with someone like James Paul McCartney on board, the band will start going places. Lennon did not personally tell McCartney his decision. Pete Shotton, a member of John's band, the Quarrymen, got hold of Paul around 2 weeks after the performance in Woolton while he was riding his bike. Paul thought about it for a moment and then said yes. A whole 3 months went by before they performed together, and Paul messed it up. He was so nervous that his carefully practiced guitar solo ended up wildly discordant. At this time, there were 5 members of the Quarrymen, and although the other members didn't take the band as seriously as John and Paul, it wasn't easy for George Harrison, aged just 15, to join the band. A 2.5-year age difference is no small thing for teenagers, but there were 2 things which made Paul's younger schoolmate interesting to John. Although George was a quiet sort, he had a cool teddy boy haircut, and he could play one of Lennon's favourite songs, the instrumental piece Raunchy. Although, or precisely because, performances were pretty infrequent at this time, the band was active in songwriting. They wrote original versions of songs like Love Me Do, One After 909, and When I'm 64. They even made a gramophone record which included a cover of Buddy Holly's That'll Be the Day, and a joint composition by Paul and George, In Spite of All the Danger. But things didn't look good for the Quarrymen. They flunked an audition for a TV show, and George Harrison began to play in other bands, including the Les Stewart Quartet. As chance would have it, due to a dispute with the lead singer, this band were unable to fulfill an engagement to play at the Casbah Coffee Club, a small Liverpool cellar bar. The group's bass player, Ken Brown, asked George whether he knew anyone else who could do it. From then on, the Quarrymen played at the Casbah Coffee Club every Saturday. Ken Brown also hooked up with the band, but only for 6 weeks. Brown was angry with Paul for not paying him his fee after he missed a concert with a cold. The setbacks piled up. Another TV audition fell flat because the musicians couldn't afford to stay overnight in Manchester. Before the public could determine the winner of the evening audition with the strength of their applause, Johnny and the Moondogs, as the band was then called, were sitting on the last train to Liverpool. 1959 drew to a close, and any other teenage combo in the same situation might have given up, but not John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison. 1960 began with an important new opening for the Quarrymen. Stuart Ferguson Victor Sutcliffe was a close friend of John Lennon from art college. Stuart was a budding artist, but he was equally keen on a musical career. Although an unskilled and untalented musician, he became the Quarrymen's new bass player. John persuaded him to get himself a Hofner President guitar, which he did with the proceeds from one of his paintings, which had just sold for the princely sum of £65. As a person, Stu was a real addition to the band, and he hardly interfered with their music, as he often turned his back to the crowd while on stage, so that no one noticed that he only ever plucked mechanically at the fat strings with one finger. And Stuart Sutcliffe had one not entirely unimportant idea. He suggested a new name for the group, Beatles, spelled B-E-A-T-A-L-S. Alan Williams got to know the foursome in his cafe Jacaranda, where they sometimes had espressos. The powerfully built 29-year-old decided to wangle some gigs for the band every now and then. The Beatles historian Mark Lewison refers to Williams as a quasi-manager. And he did some good work. He managed to get the Beatles an audition with Larry Parnes, a concert organizer from London, who was looking for support bands for his solo artists. But John, Paul, George and Stuart was still missing a drummer. The drummer, Tommy Moore, was somewhat older than the four Beatles, but at least thanks to Williams, the band had now someone to set the rhythm. Then there were problems with the band's name, which no one except for the Beatles really liked. Long John and the Silver Beatles was one suggestion, but Lennon refused to be called Long John. The group changed the spelling of their name to Beatles, spelt with a double E, like the insects. The audition to play with Pound's singing wonder Billy Fury was a disaster. Tommy Moore, the new man on the drums, arrived too late. His replacement, Johnny Hutchinson, from the competing band Cass and the Casanovas, saw it as a chore and accordingly came across as bored. When Tommy Moore finally did arrive in time to accompany the remaining couple of songs, it was already obvious to those taking part that the new job as backing band for the great Billy Fury was long gone. But Pounds had some more cards up his sleeve, one of which related to the artist Johnny Gentle. The Silver Beatles were to do a small tour with him in the northeast of England and Scotland. John Lennon and Sutcliffe gave up their studies straight away. George Harrison and Tommy Moore took time off work. Only Paul had to do some persuading to get his father to agree to let him go. The way into glamorous show business was finally open. At least that was what the band thought. But the tour turned into a near catastrophe. The organizers were so bad at paying that the group could not even afford regular meals. And then Johnny Gentle had an accident at the wheel of the tour bus, in which Tommy Moore lost a few teeth and had to be admitted to hospital. Back in Liverpool, the five were totally disillusioned as far as show business was concerned. Although Alan Williams let the band play in his club on Mondays in exchange for a small dinner and arranged a few other little performances, Tommy Moore and his girlfriend in particular had had enough of rock and roll. Tommy left the band and they were without a drummer again. In spite of a few gigs which the Silver Beats played at the Grosvenor Ballroom with Jerry and the Pacemakers, the low point for the band, again reduced to a foursome, came in the form of Janice. The stripper hired the band to provide background music for her strip routine. A temp drummer called Norman Chapman stayed for 3 whole gigs until he was called up for military service. That was also on the cards for Lennon, McCartney, Harrison and Sutcliffe. But then came Hamburg. "You must come over here to Hamburg and bring a few bands to play here," read a letter which Alan Williams received from Germany in June. The letter was sent by the Royal Caribbean Steel Band, who used to be regulars in his bar, Jacaranda. Williams smelt money and went over. In his luggage was an audio tape with recordings of his bands: the Silver Beatles, Jerry and the Pacemakers, Cass and the Casanovas, and others. But the tape was blank. When Williams wanted to play it to Bruno Koschmider, who ran the Kaiserkeller nightclub in Hamburg, there was nothing there except white noise. The tape must have been demagnetized somewhere. Disappointed, Williams left and went back to Liverpool. It was pure chance that Williams and Koschmider bumped into one another again in the Two Eyes Coffee Bar in London. Koschmider, impressed by the spectacular failure of Williams' introduction a few weeks earlier, wanted to hear the English wonder bands for himself and mistakenly travelled to London instead of Liverpool. He took on Derry and the Seniors, who went on stage in the Kaiserkeller at the end of July 1960. But Koschmider wanted more new English bands in the North German harbour metropolis, and Williams was on the verge of sending the Silver Beatles, provided that they finally found themselves a permanent drummer. They didn't have to look for long before running into Randolph Peter Best in the Kasbah Coffee Club. He had a brand new drum set and was planning a career as a professional drummer. When Pete Best answered yes to the question of whether he wanted to join the Silver Beatles, the band had everything they needed to travel to Hamburg 4 days later. They left for Germany on the 16th of August in Alan Williams' green Austin van. They were now called the Beatles. The Kaiserkeller, located at 36 Große Freiheit in the St. Pauli quarter of Hamburg, was a respectable place. But the Beatles did not play there. Koschmider wanted the band to play at his second club, a former strip joint called Indra. John, Paul, George, Stuart and Pete's accommodation was as dingy as the place where they were performing. When their performances at Indra were over, which lasted between 4.5 to 6 hours, they slept in the almost derelict back room of the Bambi Cinema. They washed in the visitors' toilets. The Indra Club didn't last long. The locals were used to the traditional nighttime entertainment and not loud, energetic beat music. The police intervened and the Beatles were told to play more quietly, and then still more quietly. But as the historian Mark Lewison so aptly observes, Long Tall Sally was simply not written for whispering. Koschmider had to close the Indra after 48 days, but for the Liverpool Quintet, this was the next step upwards. From the beginning of October 1960, the Beatles played at the Kaiserkeller. The big stage at the new club, which seemed huge in comparison to those at their earlier venues, annoyed the band. Alan Williams couldn't bear the way his boys just stood there, as though they didn't have anywhere to go, almost like they'd taken root. "Make a show, boys," he called to them, and Bruno Koschmider and his men echoed him. The Beatles, and John Lennon in particular, were only too pleased by this request. John began to jump around like a crazy man. All this stage show had the effect of making the not always loyal Hamburg public eager for more from the Beatles. On the 15th of October 1960, a fateful meeting took place. After the contract had expired for Derry and the Seniors, who had been playing at the Kaiserkeller, Koschmider had brought Rory Storm and the Hurricanes to Hamburg. And that day, John, Paul and George met two members of that band in a small Hamburg studio to record a version of a George Gershwin classic, Summertime. Pete Best didn't go, and so it came about that the Hurricanes drummer took a seat at the drums. For the very first time, the Beatles played with Richard Starkey, whose stage name was Ringo Starr. Although the four got on really well, there was no reason for Ringo to lead the Hurricanes. especially as the Beatles were on the brink of their next crisis. At the end of October, a new club opened on the Reeperbahn, the Top 10 Club, which, like the Indra, had formerly belonged to the red light district. A young British musician called Tony Sheridan was playing there with his band, the Jets, and the Beatles often went there in their breaks to see Sheridan and jam with him. This did not suit Bruno Koschmider, who had written into their contract that they were not to perform within a 25-mile radius of the Kaiserkeller without his permission. Koschmider did not renew the Beatles' contract. In addition, it had somehow come to the attention of the German authorities that George Harrison was not yet 18, and so was not permitted to be in clubs after 10 o'clock in the evening. He was deported from Germany. Although the remaining Beatles managed without George as best they could for a while, and were now officially allowed to play at the Top 10, a further misfortune befell the band while they were in Germany. Paul and Pete set the wallpaper on fire in their digs in the Bambi Cinema. Although nothing else happened, Koschmider notified the police. Within a few hours, McCartney and Best were also back in Liverpool. And then there were just two. John travelled voluntarily back to England in the end, but Stuart stayed. He had fallen in love in Hamburg and was engaged to the photographer Astrid Kircher. Chas Newby, a school friend of Pete Best, filled the vacancy on bass for a few gigs. Although he didn't stay with the group, he got to experience the beginnings of Beatlemania on 27th of December 1960. At Litherland Town Hall, the Beatles showed Liverpool what they had learnt in Hamburg, and the whole crowd ran riot. The promoter Brian Kelly, who was really only doing Liverpool DJ Bob Wooler a favour with the Beatles gig at Litherland, now saw there was good money to be earned with the group. He booked the band for a further 36 gigs around Merseyside, the area around Liverpool, and so brought the Beatles to the fore of the local rock bands. It can't have been easy for Paul McCartney to leave his usual position on guitar and piano at this time, on John Lennon's insistence, and take over the vacant spot on bass. Pete Best and his mother Mona took over the booking of gigs a short time later. They booked the band virtually round the clock. Sometimes the Beatles did 3 gigs on a single day. The clubs were not always the cream of the crop, and sometimes there were even mini riots. But the Beatles muddled on through. Meanwhile, they even had a road manager, Neil Aspinall, one of Pete Best's mates, who sat at the wheel when the band toured from concert to concert. The venues were getting better, and the Cavern Club in the heart of Liverpool enjoyed the reputation of not being quite as rough as many of the other places in the area. It was just unfortunate that they had declined to play beat music up until now and opted for sophisticated jazz instead. The Beatles had to wait a whole 9 months for their debut at the Cavern. It finally happened at around midday on the 9th of February, 1961. For the next 2.5 years, the Cavern was like the band's second home. The Beatles were a symbol of the Cellar Club and became synonymous with it. They even had fan clubs with their own names, the Cement Mixers, the Bulldog Gang, or the Wooden Tops. The boys loved the group's unbelievable coolness, while the girls went mad for the look. Pete Best was without doubt their favourite, not only for his good looks, but his innocent diffidence and reserve brought him scores of marriage proposals. But before all this could happen, the Beatles went on another trip to Hamburg. Pete Best and his mother had to write tons of letters to the German authorities in order to persuade them that the band were nice, law-abiding citizens. The manager of the Top 10 Club, Peter Eckhorn, even paid 158 marks to the authorities to cover the costs of the deportation of Pete and Paul a couple of months earlier. Of course, he deducted the money from their fee. In the meantime, George had turned 18, and so nothing stood in the way of their working in the Hanseatic city. From the 1st of April 1961, the Beatles played at the top 10 for 7 hours a day during the week and 8 hours a day at the weekend, including a 15-minute break every hour. From this point on, Alan Williams lost his job as manager. The unpleasant task of writing to Williams to inform him that he would not be getting his payment, since the group had arranged the contract at the top 10 club themselves, fell to Stuart Sutcliffe. Williams was furious and wrote an angry letter back, but calmed down again in time. Stu was not in fact playing regularly with the Beatles any longer. He had started to study art again in Hamburg, but joined his friends on stage in the evenings now and then for old times' sake. Meanwhile, his fiancée, Astrid Kirchherr, took photos of the band. Stuart changed his hairstyle around this time, letting it grow longer and combing it forwards, which caused John, Paul, George and Pete to break out in peals of laughter. In addition to their own gigs at the Top 10 Club, the Beatles often accompanied Tony Sheridan as his backing band. Musically, Sheridan was no dark horse. He had released albums and had TV appearances in the UK. Sheridan also had a recording contract in Germany with the record label Deutsche Grammophon. The musician and bandleader Bert Kempfert saw Sheridan performing with the Beatles and asked him if he would like to record with the record label Polydor. The Beatles accompanied Sheridan on 5 songs and were even allowed to do 2 of their own. Their tracks were Ain't She Sweet, with Lennon as the lead vocalist, and the instrumental number Cry for a Shadow, composed jointly by George Harrison and John Lennon. The record company Polydor chose My Bonnie as the single, an old Scottish folk song which Sheridan had, with some skill, transformed into a modern beat number. But the Beatles were not even mentioned on the album cover. Tony Sheridan and the Beat Brothers was written on the sleeve, as the company had concerns about using the group's real name. They thought Beatles sounded like Beatles, and a Beatle was Hamburg slang for nothing other than a penis. Sheridan and the Beat Brothers sold 100,000 copies of My Bonnie in Germany. Back in Liverpool at the Cavern Club again, the band were aware that things weren't going that well in their hometown, despite the storms of applause. The beat scene now had its own magazine, The Mersey Beat, published by John's school friend Bill Harry, and the Beatles often made it onto the front cover, but on the whole they were just treading water. In autumn of 1961, the manager of the North End music store in Whitechapel became aware of the Beatles. We can't be completely sure what exactly aroused his interest in the band, but he may well have been reading the Mersey Beat, or possibly people asking for the German single My Bonnie in his shop. When he discovered that the band regularly played just a few hundred yards away from his shop at the Cavern Club, he decided to look into the matter and went to see the Beatles live in Matthew Street. When Brian Samuel Epstein saw the 4 musicians on the cramped, stuffy little stage, he was captivated. Brian Epstein did not immediately sign the Beatles up, however. Whenever he could, he went back to the Cavern and talked to Lennon, McCartney, Harrison and Best. But the band and the 27-year-old suit wearer were worlds apart. Apart from anything, he wasn't exactly sure how he should set the Beatles up. He sold records. He wasn't the boss of a record label. But at the beginning of December of 61, he made the group an offer. For 25% of their income, he would find them decent gigs, not only in Liverpool but also elsewhere. In addition, he assured the Beatles that they would never have to go on stage for less than £15, except for the midday gigs at the Cavern. And he wanted to get the band a record deal. John wanted to sign at once, but Brian took his time. He wanted to work out a clear, fair contract, rather than the restrictive contracts that were customary in the music business. And before he let John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison and Pete Best sign, he wanted to prove what he was capable of. Brian's first successful move for the Beatles came about by chance. The Liverpool Echo newspaper regularly published record reviews under the title Off the Record, and the new manager thought that it would be good for his charges to have a write-up there. The problem was that the Beatles didn't have a record. This was Disker's argument, the review's author, when Epstein spoke to him. Disker's common name was Tony Barrow, and in addition to writing music critiques for the newspaper, he also worked for the Decca Music Company, writing the sleeve notes for record covers. In spite of the missing record, Barrow and Epstein met up at Decca's London offices. Epstein played a demo recording from the cavern, but Barrow was unimpressed. Yet he still recommended to Decca that they give the Beatles a chance. Epstein's shop was a good customer, after all. On New Year's Day 1962 at around 11 a.m., the Beatles played their most important gig to date. After an arduous 10-hour journey in the band's small bus, the group arrived at Decca's studios in London. Mike Smith, the A&R man, arrived late, straight from celebrating New Year's Eve, and when he saw the Beatles' modest equipment, he requested that the recording be made using the studio's more professional equipment. Time was tight because Smith had another band to see on the same day, Brian Poole and the Tremolos from Barking, Essex. Mike Smith found the recording pretty good, so that back in Liverpool, the musicians were just waiting for the OK from London. After the Beatles were signed by Brian Epstein, their future seemed rosy. My Bonnie was released in the UK on Epstein's initiative, there was a BBC radio interview, and there were some excellent engagements lined up following a third Hamburg trip in the spring. The new man had got things going, and he made sure that the Beatles actually used their pop star qualities out there on the stage. From now on, no gig was to last longer than 60 minutes, and the set list would be worked out in advance. Jeans and leather jackets were out. Instead of their James Dean look, the Beatles now wore suits. Each of the finely tailored suits cost £40, from Beno Dawn's tailors in Birkenhead. And then the unimaginable happened. Decca said no to the Beatles. Brian Epstein's master plan had failed for the time being. Brian Epstein, usually so businesslike and cautious, was beside himself. "The Beatles are going to be bigger than Elvis Presley. You must be out of your minds," he shouted at the Decca representatives. But it didn't help matters. It was a definite no, and the decision now stands as one of the biggest mistakes in the history of pop music. Although Decca was not the only record company who failed to recognize that the Beatles had a great future ahead of them. The EMI labels Columbia and HMV also sent written rejections. But fortune came to Epstein's aid, and once again the businessman knew how to make the best of the situation. He took the rejected Decca recording and went to see a friend of his who managed a record shop in Oxford Street. The HMV branch manager, Bob Boast. Boast couldn't help him in his search for a label, but suggested making a few 78 records of the Decca tapes in his shop. He argued they would be much more appealing for demonstration purposes. Epstein agreed. The man who produced the discs was called Jim Foy, and he shared Epstein's enthusiasm for the Beatles. The manager told the technician proudly that his boys had written 3 of the 15 songs themselves. Foy asked Epstein whether he knew that a subsidiary of EMI, Ardmore and Beechwood, had moved into one floor above the shop. The firm's boss, Sid Coleman, was equally impressed by what he heard, but could not offer Epstein more than a telephone call with the EMI label Parlophone, which up until now had a reputation for comedy rather than pop recordings. Epstein eventually met with the talent scout and producer of this label on the 13th of February, 1962, in their offices on Manchester Square. And George Martin heard something in the music which had been missed by all the previous A&R people. He decided that the Beatles were worth a closer look. But no arrangements were made, and months went by before that first meeting. Thanks to their regular income, the Beatles set off by plane for their third visit to Hamburg on the 11th of April. Horst Fascher, the former doorman at the Kaiserkeller and the Top Ten Club, had engaged the band at a new location, which was being opened by promoter Manfred Weißlieder at 39 Große Freiheit. The Star Club, or as it was really called, the Star Club. They were met at Hamburg Airport by Astrid Kirchherr, the fiancée of their ex-bassist Stuart Sutcliffe. The news Astrid gave the band at the airport came as a massive shock, especially for John. Stu was dead, killed by a brain hemorrhage at the age of 21. The Beatles needed 2 days to recover from the shock. An eternity when one thinks of the pressure the group was under in the face of their new commitments. The Beatles remained in Hamburg until the 31st of May, but Brian Epstein came back earlier. In spite of the crushing number of rejections, the 28-year-old Epstein had not yet given up hope of a record deal. And although George Martin had not been in touch since their meeting, neither had he said no. On the 9th of May 1962, the two men met again, and to Brian's surprise, George Martin, 8 years older than Brian, held out an official document to him. What George Martin was offering the Beatles was a sort of trial record contract. If he liked the band once he had seen them play live, nothing more would stand in the way of his signature. So it was still neither a yes nor a no from the venerable EMI. Brian Epstein, always concerned to keep his boys happy, sent a telegram just saying that the firm was offering a recording session, together with congratulations and the request to keep rehearsing the new songs. There was plenty of opportunity for this in Hamburg's Star Club. They gave almost nightly concerts there until the end of May 1962. On the 6th of June, they finally made their way to St. John's Wood in London, to a whitewashed 2-story building where EMI had been making recordings since 1931. The house was at number 3 Abbey Road. Between 7 and 10 p.m., the Beatles gave it their all. It wasn't George Martin himself, but his technical assistant Norman Smith, who first noticed how Love Me Do stood out from the rest of the compositions. The master himself wasn't there. Smith had to go and fetch him. Martin was utterly captivated by what he heard, but it wasn't just the music, it was the charisma of the 4 Liverpudlians which in the end persuaded Martin to put his signature to the contract. From then on, for John, Paul and George, the only way was up. And the fourth man, Pete Best. By the time of their second meeting with EMI in London, he was already gone. Instead, on the 18th of August, 1962, it was Ringo Starr who was on drums. What happened before that day belongs on the one hand to the most inglorious chapter in the history of the Fab Four. But on the other is also a touching story of 3 lads who just really wanted their mate Ringo to be in their band. Pete Best and George Martin noticed this straight away, somehow didn't fit in with the Beatles. He wasn't hearty or funny like the others were, but withdrawn and incredibly shy. Ringo, on the other hand, was a real joker, a genuine Liverpudlian, a likeable guy. It wasn't for nothing that the 3 had spent hours with him in Hamburg, staying up all night. In February 1962, Ringo even helped out as the Beatles' drummer when Pete was ill. John, Paul and George got on brilliantly with him, and he was a decent drummer too. The sort of artistic pressure that the Beatles were working under is shown by the fact that when John married his girlfriend, Cynthia Powell, just 5 days after Ringo joined the band, he was on stage with the Beatles again that same night. The Beatles were on the brink, the very brink of their breakthrough. In his role as the Beatles' new record producer, George Martin was anything but indulgent. He wasn't satisfied with the recording after the group's first session and had the Beatles come back again, this time with Ringo in tow. Love Me Do was one of the recordings again, and Ringo was on the drums. A few days later, Martin asked them to come back into the studio again. This time he had the professional drummer Andy White there and banished Ringo, who had little experience of the studio, to the tambourine. It was a version of Love Me Do recorded on this 11th September, which made history as the Beatles' first single. The version with Ringo on drums was also available for a short time on the first release of the 45 record, but by the time the second release of the single came out, it had been substituted by Martin for the Andy White version. The single Love Me Do and its B-side, P.S. I Love You, did not have huge success in the charts. After their entry at number 49 in the hit parade, they faltered around between 20 and 40, before finally achieving their highest place at number 17. The gossip ran that Brian Epstein had spent a fortune and bought up 10,000 copies himself to push the song. 5 days before the release, he had signed a 5-year contract with the band. Brian never stopped contesting the accusations. Before the end of the year, when the Beatles went to Hamburg again to play gigs which had been arranged months earlier, they recorded their second single at the EMI studios. The song was called Please Please Me and was an obvious homage to the US rock and roller Roy Orbison. 1962 ended with a bang for the Beatles. They didn't only scoop up a comfortable first place in the Mersey Beat's end-of-year approval ratings, but the national New Musical Express magazine and its readers were also taking notice of the newcomers from Liverpool. The Beatles won 5th place for the best British group. EMI was hardly shy when it came to releases. Please Please Me came out at the beginning of January 63 and brought the band 2 things. The first was an appearance on national TV, and the second was a long-term presence on the radio, not just in Liverpool, but throughout Great Britain. The loyal Liverpool fans noticed that slowly but surely their band was outgrowing the town. The gigs at the Cavern became less frequent, until finally they stopped altogether, and the Beatles changed their base to London. The moment of truth came during a gig at the Cavern. The band had just gone on stage and were about to start when a telegram arrived, and club DJ Bob Wooler read out that Please Please Me had reached the top spot in the NME charts. The silence which came over the audience in the Cavern that day became a legend. Rarely in the rock business have tears of joy and farewell mingled as closely together as on that 19th of February in Matthew Street. For the Beatles, life exploded. Alongside all the business sense which Brian Epstein demonstrated, and all the professionalism of producer George Martin, and quite apart from the band's image and appearance, it was quite simply the music which won the day, just as it once took hold of the Star and Cavern clubs. Give the Beatles an audience and they would enthrall it, and the audience grew and grew and grew. From Me to You, released in April '63, marked the beginning of the Beatles' mega success, the time when a new single from the foursome would naturally shoot to number 1 in the charts, as if they were the only artists around. And that's kind of how it was. On a tour where the Beatles were supposed to be the support band for US rockers Tommy Roe and Chris Montez, the 2 Americans were demoted to warm-ups for John, Paul, George and Ringo Starr, who, meanwhile, had even won over the old Liverpool fan base. It did seem to make a difference whether it was 4 like-minded friends standing on the stage or just 3 friends with an acquaintance like Pete Best. and the rest of the world didn't know who the former drummer was anyway. Following in the Beatles' wake were a stack of other musicians from the Mersey region at the top of the charts. Bands like Jerry and the Pacemakers, the Searchers, the Mersey Beats, and the fantastic Swinging Blue Jeans. The conception of youth and its connection to pop music began to change in ways which continue to influence our thinking today. The main thrust of this change was the idea that you didn't have to be a born star or to be able to do everything at once in order to impress the world. 4 boys from next door had done it in a band, and you could too if you had a band. And just as the Beatles had no obvious band leader, so most other newly formed groups had at least 2 people at the microphone, and they dared to write a few songs, just like Lennon and McCartney did. In spite of their total separation from the masses from this point on, the Beatles brought fans and stars closer together, and they did that in the face of the rising Beatlemania. In the summer of 1963, the UK's big, serious music papers devoted themselves entirely to the phenomenon from Liverpool. Teenage magazines like Boyfriend and Valentine also had the Beatles on their covers. The band became quite simply ubiquitous through Great Britain. BBC Radio, TV, everybody wanted the Beatles nationwide. The debut album with the title, Please Please Me, spent an unbelievable 30 weeks at the top of the charts, only to be replaced by their next album, With the Beatles, which was held back by EMI until the sales of Please Please Me finally began to fall. The Beatles were delighted to be able to go on tour with their idol Roy Orbison. The great Roy Orbison had been inspirational for John and Paul in the composition of Please Please Me. But even he, a global star from the USA, played second fiddle on their joint tour appearances. His countless hits such as the new Oh Pretty Woman were of no use. No one could compete with the Beatles now. But for a long time this did not mean that the Beatles were rich or even well off. Brian Epstein had arranged dozens of gigs in advance, which must have seemed downright lousy to the band after their breakthrough. Epstein never refused a single organizer by claiming that his artists were ill, a fairly common business practice. Epstein honored all agreements. Only occasionally, and by mutual consent, did he pay compensation for not doing a gig. According to Mark Lewison in his biography, not a single business partner ever complained about Brian Epstein. The Beatles' achievements within just a few short months are incredible. Alongside all their gigs, TV appearances, and radio interviews, the 4 recorded their second album and, with She Loves You, the battle cry of a whole generation. On the 3rd of August 1963, the Beatles appeared at the Cavern Club for the last time. It wasn't that the band didn't want to perform there anymore, but the cellar bar was simply too small to cope with the hordes who followed the musicians to every public appearance. And there was the question of security. It wasn't for nothing that the Beatles, with Mal Evans, a former doorman at the Cavern, sought a second assistant alongside Neil Aspinall. Brian Epstein decided that his 4 megastars, or the boys, as he called them, wouldn't do the small club scene anymore, and that they would only do concerts at locations which were at least the size of a theatre. The term Beatlemania first found its way into the British press when the group appeared at the London Palladium on the 13th of October for a TV programme. Val Parnell's Sunday night at the Palladium marked the moment when the Beatles began to be identified with screaming masses of mainly young female fans, an uproar on the part of the men. In Great Britain, at least. The Beatles' return to London following a short tour of Sweden has remained in the collective memories of both the band and the security forces. Several hundred fans with Beatles haircuts waited for their idols, screeching and whooping. According to eye and ear witnesses, they were so loud that they even drowned out the noise of the passenger plane's jets. And that kind of jet easily runs at 130 decibels. The human ear cannot take more than that without lasting damage. When the Beatles went on stage for the Royal Variety Show on the 4th of November, performing their repertoire for the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret, the fact that the arrivals of the royals was mercilessly eclipsed by that of the musicians was the least of Brian Epstein's problems. Of course, the manager wanted the royal family to like his protégés, but then they would never openly have shown themselves to be jealous. But if John Lennon had actually said on stage what he threatened to say while they were in the changing room, that would have been the end. "I'll just say to them that they should shake their shitty jewellery," John said backstage to the shocked, ever-polite and formal Brian. But during the concert, Lennon managed to make it sound almost nice. A bit sarcastic, but nice. He said, "For the next song, I'd like to ask for your help. For those of you in the cheap seats, I'd like you to clap your hands to this one. The rest of you can just rattle your jewellery." The room laughed and listened to Twist and Shout, the last number of the evening. It is revealing to see just how far Lennon was able to go without being punished. The sympathy for the working-class Liverpool foursome was simply too great. Quite simply, Beatlemania. The Beatles broke their first record with their cover of the Isley Brothers' Twist and Shout. Rather surprising, given the many Lennon-McCartney number ones over the years. It was released not as a single, so not as a 45 record with one song on each side, but as an EP. The abbreviation stands for Extended Play, meaning that each side of the record has 2 songs on it. And this EP was the first disc to get silver status for selling 250,000 copies. The album With the Beatles, recorded in the summer and first released in November, made it to 500,000. And it didn't stop there. There were already 1 million advance orders for their 5th single, I Want to Hold Your Hand, which increased by another 500,000 the day before the release. But Brian Epstein wouldn't have been Brian Epstein if he had seen this success as a chance to relax. He had already set up a 3-week engagement in Paris for the Beatles for 1964 and signed a film contract. It had also been arranged that the boys would travel to their fans in Australia and New Zealand in June. All well and good. But the world's biggest music market, the United States of America, had so far taken virtually no notice of the Beatles. Brian Epstein was ready to take a risk. If he wanted to win, 2 factors had to come together. The first factor, the Beatles needed a hit single overseas. Until now, the Liverpudlian songs had appeared with small record companies, what today we would call independent labels. So Epstein had to persuade Capitol Records, the US counterpart to EMI, finally to start pushing his boys. Using all his powers of persuasion, he managed to get Capitol to agree to release I Want to Hold Your Hand in January 1964. But as good as this Beatles single might be, Epstein knew that without a real audience, without visual contact, the breakthrough would not work. Epstein staked everything on one card, and that card was called Ed Sullivan. The long-in-the-tooth US TV entertainer was highly amused by the British fuss over the Beatles, but couldn't believe his ears when Epstein actually asked him whether his band might be able to have 3 appearances on the prominent Ed Sullivan show. Sullivan would certainly have refused if Epstein had not offered a very tempting incentive. Sullivan would let the Beatles have 3 appearances on his show, but didn't have to pay anything more than the costs of their flights and accommodation as their fee. Sullivan agreed, and, as it turned out, it was a wise decision. Parisian society clearly did not know what to make of the Beatles, and apart from that, the 3-week-long French tour was overshadowed by technical problems. But the four musicians were not too bothered by the fact that, for the first time in about a year, their Paris concerts did not lead to the complete collapse of the social order. They waited excitedly to see how I Want to Hold Your Hand would do in the USA. And again, it was a telegram, this time in the French capital, which let them know that their new single had made it to #1 in the US charts. It is not clear whether Brian Epstein had any inkling of what was about to happen. As well as Capitol Records, all the smaller companies who had released the band's previous singles now wanted a piece of the big Beatles pie. The labels Swan and VJ re-released the old recordings so that all the Beatles' 1963 singles, as well as their 2 albums, came to dominate the charts. This all happened a few days before their 3rd appearance on American national TV. Epstein made the most of it and arranged 3 additional live concerts while he was still in Paris. The Beatles' arrival at the newly christened JFK Airport in New York put everything that the Beatles had previously experienced in terms of Beatlemania into the shade. 3,000 screaming teenagers, all of them on the brink of collapse, showed the band that no European adolescent can scream as hysterically as an American one. Decades later, the journalist Larry Kane, who accompanied the Beatles on their US guest performances in 1964, asked one of the girls who had keeled over at the airport how she saw it all from her current perspective. She replied that she'd do it all over again, anytime. In 1964, she had only managed to glimpse the band for a fraction of a second. According to official figures, the Beatles' first live performance on US television was watched by a world record-breaking audience of 73 million people. It was followed by further TV appearances wisely arranged in advance by Brian Epstein, in addition to prestigious performances at Washington's Coliseum and Carnegie Hall in Manhattan. That in New York alone there were almost 400 policemen responsible for security says a lot about the state of mind of the American Beatles fans. And the phrase British invasion, describing the overseas success of British bands in the wake of the Beatles, was a not unfitting choice of words. The invasion was successful. America was seized at a single stroke. Elvis had already shot a film, and so the Beatles were not averse to doing one either. Full of wry British humour and occasionally also black comedy, under the direction of Richard Lester, the film A Hard Day's Night turned out to be what, for its time, was an original mix of comedy, documentary, and music. The German dubbing studio didn't even try to translate phrases which were steeped in the Liverpool accent, slang, and Lennon's wordplay. John and Paul, George and Ringo too, had words put in their mouths that they never said in the original, and it was nothing short of genius that the German version of A Hard Day's Night, yeah, 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 was a success, and above all, dead funny. The filming of A Hard Day's Night had a private significance for George, who got to know Pattie Boyd on set, who was playing one of the Beatles' mad schoolgirls. The two later married. The vast amount of activities taken on by the Beatles in the beginning and middle of 1964 did not only lead to them occupying places 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in the US single charts, but also to Ringo being unable to stand the pressure anymore, becoming ill and collapsing. His collapse came a day before their scheduled departure for Sydney. In Australia, the Beatles even held the first 6 places in the charts. It took Brian Epstein and George Martin hours of persuasion to convince the band, and George Harrison especially, to fly without Ringo and to accept a stand-in drummer. George had threatened not to go anywhere without Ringo. And so from the beginning it had to be made clear to the replacement that in no circumstances was he going to be playing with the Beatles for longer than was absolutely necessary. Epstein found what he was looking for in Jimmy Nicol, a drummer who had already accompanied big-name acts like Tommy Quickly and who had also recorded an LP of Beatles covers. A short rehearsal of 6 songs was all that was needed. Hours later, the 3 Beatles and Jimmy Nicol were sitting on a plane to Sydney. The streets of the bigger towns down under were like a madhouse. 24 hours of chaos resulting in numerous injuries. It was worse in Adelaide and Melbourne. In both towns, an unbelievable mass of more than 250,000 people gathered around the Beatles' hotels, cheering, screaming, and going completely wild. Ringo joined the Beatles again in Melbourne, having recovered from his tonsillitis. Jimmy Nicol received £500 plus expenses and a gold watch. The Beatles never went to Australia again. In 1964, everything started working all at once. When A Hard Day's Night celebrated its London premiere on 6th of July, the critics were as ecstatic as the thousands of fans. At its first showing in Liverpool, every 4th inhabitant stood on the streets to receive the working town's great sons. Not even the experts are quite sure how John Lennon and Paul McCartney managed to produce an LP with 13 first-class original compositions in the midst of all this chaos. The next visit to the US turned into a monster tour. 26 concerts in 24 towns in 34 days. A tour on which the Fab Four were either on the stage, in a hotel room, or in the air, hardly even registering the names of the towns in which they were playing. Upon their arrival in San Francisco on the 18th of August, they were surrounded by 9,000 fans, 3 times as many as at JFK Airport a few months earlier. No wonder that the fence broke. The Beatles escaped just in time, and from then on had continual police protection. Tour reporter Larry Kane observed something else besides the record sum which the Beatles were paid for an additional concert in Kansas City on one of their few free days. The audience no longer consisted exclusively of teenagers. Young adults were also discovering the Liverpool group, a fact which, for a short time, meant that the concerts became relatively audible. Adults just don't scream as much. But producer George Martin, who wanted to do an official live take, still found that the mass cheering was as loud as the jets of a 747. Only in 1977, 13 years after the tour, did he manage to produce a master tape worthy of the Beatles, using the newly developed noise-cancelling technology. The Beatles at the Hollywood Bowl was the only official live album. Beatlemania in the USA assumed grotesque proportions. The bed linen in which the 4 were supposed to have slept was auctioned off by a hotel owner. Used hand towels were cut into pieces so as to get more profit out of the terry toweling. In New York, you could purchase cans supposedly containing air breathed by the Beatles. Sometimes people with disabilities were even taken backstage in order to be touched by the musicians' healing hands. Truthfully, the Beatles were more popular than Jesus Christ. But woe betide anyone who dared to say it. The tour of Great Britain, which followed the US tour, was pure routine for Lennon, McCartney, Harrison and Starr, as far as that was possible inside Beatlemania. But in contrast to Australia and America, where they even had to play the Las Vegas gig in the face of an anonymous bomb threat, the British fans looked like model students, but only just. Although it was recorded in a hurry, Beatles for Sale, like everything the band did in those days, was a fantastic record. And it went to number 1, too. Everything was different with Help. Help was John's cry for help, although Lennon had no idea what he wanted help with or from whom. Was it part of his endless dissembling or public posturing? Drugs? His failed marriage? Help is not a happy song. It is one of the darker titles that Lennon ever put down on paper. But the film that went with it, the German version was called Hilfe, was the complete opposite. The soundtrack to Help, released as the 5th Beatles album, offered more than the high standard to which people were accustomed. With Yesterday, it contained a piece of cultural heritage. One night in 1964, in the London flat of his girlfriend, Jane Asher, Paul McCartney dreamed one of the tunes of the century. In the morning, busy on the toilet just before breakfast, he sang quietly to himself, "Scrambled eggs, oh my baby, how I love your legs." But was it really his newest creation? Paul was afraid that he might not have thought up this short, simple but inspired melody himself. Perhaps, McCartney thought at first, he might have unknowingly picked it up somewhere. But his fellow band members, the producer, technician and a load of friends, reassured him that it sounded really good and that it was his own. The song was still called Scrambled Eggs. John Lennon liked the title and made jokes about it, but he knew that a more suitable name had to be found. Paul McCartney finally decided on Yesterday in 1965, after months of deliberation. But not because he was thinking of the passage of time and the transience of existence, or even of consciousness, no. He liked the word yesterday because of all the different possibilities of rhyming with it, like the rhyme with suddenly in the second verse. Yesterday finally took shape on the 27th of May 1965 during a holiday in the Portuguese Algarve. The text was all right, but just lacked the right arrangement. A good 2 weeks later, on the 14th of June, Paul recorded it with an acoustic guitar in 2 takes, and the basic structure was done. That the whole band was not playing on the recording may have been down to George Martin, who had probably recognized the sort of power Yesterday was capable of expressing by omitting drums, bass and solo guitar. As proof of this, on the few occasions where the Beatles did play the song as a complete ensemble, it turned out pretty badly. In place of the rhythm section, George Martin used a 4-part string section to accentuate the timeless melancholy of Yesterday, a hint of the melancholy moodiness one normally associates with John Lennon. The other members of the group had no problems with Paul's own solo number. The release as a single was out of the question, as the Beatles at that point in time didn't normally release LP tracks as singles in the UK. So Yesterday was released in the US as the B-side of Ringo's cover version of Act Naturally. Success came quickly and overwhelmingly, as in the States, A and B sides were regarded as separate entities in the charts. Yesterday held the number 1 spot for a whole month. Since then, Yesterday has been covered at least 3,000 times by other artists, an unbeaten record. It is difficult to ascertain precisely when the slow end of Beatlemania began. The award of the MBE, the member of the most excellent order of the British Empire, to all 4 members of the band, possibly marked the high point of the hype, despite John Lennon's suspicions. The short tour of summer 1965 through France, Italy and Spain was anything but a flop, but the concerts were not always sold out. That wasn't a cause for concern in the Beatles camp, though. The Americans more than made up for it. It was the biggest live audience that the world had ever seen. 55,600 fans packed themselves into New York's Shea Stadium. The Beatles experienced the most that it was possible for a four-man rock and roll band to achieve. The gig was recorded for TV. John, Paul, George and Ringo gave it their all. A satisfied Brian Epstein kept time next to the stage, as well as he could. Ringo complained that at these giant concerts the band could simply stop playing mid-song. The crowd wouldn't notice. Given the relative volumes of the band and the audience, that may not have been such an exaggeration. In the Shea Stadium, the sound was transmitted to the stadium complex via the little stage amplifiers, which were otherwise used for announcing scores in sports matches. Was that a problem? No. This time in the Shea Stadium, the Beatles really were good. At the end of August 1965, the Beatles met their collective idol. Elvis Aaron Presley still lived in Bel Air, Hollywood, in the state of California. On the evening of the 27th, the King sat with a bass guitar and an amplifier in front of his color TV, which, unbelievably for 1965, when such things were practically reserved for NASA and James Bond, was actually operated by remote control. No one knew what to say, and so a spontaneous jam session was the only way to get through the evening without embarrassing silences. John Lennon is supposed to have called out, "Long live the King," in farewell to his hero, but that couldn't have done much to alter the gloomy mood which John himself had brought about a few hours earlier. Elvis, Lennon is supposed to have said, "When you are besieged by fans, you're on your own. On the other hand, we four stand together against the rest of the world, and we can support each other." After that, the King became introspective. The Beatles had an easier time with the other big names in American music, specifically with the Byrds, their favorite U.S. band. George could discuss instruments for hours with Byrds frontman Roger McGuinn, such as 12-stringed Rickenbacker guitars and their amazing sound. And it's no coincidence that Harrison can be seen wearing angular red sunglasses on photos and films from that time. McGuinn wore his for the whole of the 60s. If you only look at the concerts from those days, you could be forgiven for thinking that the Beatles had become lazy. But on the first day of their 1965 tour through Great Britain, which, though no one knew it yet, was to be their last home tour, the album Rubber Soul appeared, which was pioneering for so many others apart from the Beatles. The studio had become the foursome's place of creative retreat. Here, together with George Martin, they worked out alternative song structures, harmonic bass lines, X-Factor harmonies, and experimented with the use of instruments that were untypical for the rock genre. With its classic songwriting, Rubber Soul is a record which many fans still regard as their favorite album today. In 1966, barely 4 years after their time in Hamburg, the Beatles returned to Germany. In Germany, as in the rest of Europe, Beatlemania took a while to get going. While in Great Britain the album Please Please Me had spent 16 weeks at #1, and since October of that year, crowds and mass hysteria had been the order of the day. The news coverage in Germany's leading youth and music paper Bravo was notably restrained. In 1963, the editorial team still didn't think that anything would come of the Beatles. So issue 49 states, "The Beatles are a quartet who produce a stomping twist rhythm on 3 electric guitars and a drum, and sing lyrics which are practically all made up of the same 100 simple words." With their Thomas Fritsch hairdos, high shirt collars, and shiny silk jackets, they are little more than chance beneficiaries of a crazy fashion. Bravo recognized its mistake early enough. In 1964, issue 22, the Beatles graced the front cover of the magazine for the first time. The following week, there was a cutout kit for a Beatles wig. From then on, the band were in every issue, from November 1965 to August 1966. 9 whole months. Bravo put out, week by week and piece by piece, the biggest star poster in its history. Yet the Beatles stayed away from Germany. Why? Bild was reporting plenty of alleged paternity suits. Criminal prosecution was also part of the picture, since during their time in Hamburg, the band was supposed to have urinated from the pulpit of St. Joseph's Church. In the end, the reasons for the Beatles' absence may have been financial ones. Markets such as the USA were simply more lucrative. In January 1966, the teenage magazine OK, which meanwhile had become Bravo's immediate competitor, reported that the concert organizer Karl Buchmann was in the process of organizing a Beatles tour involving 7 German cities. The possible locations under discussion were Berlin, Hamburg, Essen, Munich, Münster, Dortmund and Cologne. Berlin was soon out of the running as there was no suitable stage, since the Waldbühne with its 21,000 seats was still dealing with 7.5 kilometers of destroyed bench seating, the legacy of a Rolling Stones concert. But Bravo did not give up the fight with OK over the Beatles. It sponsored the tour. In 1966, the magazine put the 4 musicians on its front cover a total of 14 times, and it was hardly a surprise when the Golden Otto, the magazine's own star award, went to the Beatles that year. From then on, there was only one subject for Bravo: Beatles first, Beatles last. The magazine made sure that no German Beatles fan could pass it by. And in order to remind people of that connection even more, the editorial staff thought of a name for the tour: the Bravo Beatles Blitz Tour. Not exactly a happy choice, since in Great Britain it was associated with the German phrase Blitzkrieg, and so with the Nazis. John Lennon may have found it bizarrely amusing, but in the end neither the Beatles nor their management were bothered by it. In their records, the tour was simply called 1966 Summer Tour Germany and Japan. No word of Bravo or Blitz. But Bravo attributed richly militaristic sentences to the Beatles. "For 3 days we are ruling Germany," they are supposed to have said. And the phrase Beat Regiment was even pushed onto John Lennon. In fact, John, George, Paul and Ringo had grown tired of concerts. Although they now had amplifiers with an unbelievable 150 watts, their performances were not particularly high quality. For one thing, this was due to the permanent jubilation and screaming, which was certainly flattering, but also incredibly wearing. Another reason was that they didn't hear their own music on stage. The difficulty was compounded by the fact that the Beatles could only perform their newest compositions, which they wrote for and around the time of Rubber Soul and the not-yet-released album Revolver, live on stage with serious difficulties, if at all. The harmonies on Paul's Paperback Writer, the latest addition to their tour program, did work, with some unevenness, as well as If I Needed Someone, the only song where George was lead singer. But Lennon's Day Tripper created a lot of difficulties, and his Nowhere Man, with its delicate a cappella intro, was borderline rather than good at most performances. The rest of the program had to be filled with older songs: rock and roll music, She's a Woman, Babies in Black, I Feel Fine, Yesterday, I'm Down, and Ringo's vocal number, I Wanna Be Your Man. 11 songs altogether. The Beatles played for around 30 minutes at 5 p.m. and then again at 9 p.m. in 3 German cities. Fans were transported to the venues in special trains sponsored by Bravo. 4 trains went to Munich with funny names thought up by the organizer, Hummelreisen, Speeding John, Flying Paul, Fast George and Rolling Ringo. The Liverpool Express, the Beat Train, the Bravo Blitz, and last but not least, the Schnelle Michelle went to Essen. The third venue, Hamburg, was served by 6 of these 8 trains, and in total there were, believe it or not, 18 extra services, as well as additional flights to Hamburg from West Berlin. The album Revolver, recorded shortly before the 1966 concert tour, shows how the Beatles had outgrown themselves, or rather their image. The 4 musicians had matured, but their audiences, on the other hand, had not. The press still liked to use the term teenage idols, synonymously with the Beatles. But Beatlemania did not get along all that well with the melancholy of Eleanor Rigby, the bitter fiscal critique of Taxman, or the drug-soaked debauchery of Tomorrow Never Knows, which, 30 years later in the mid-90s, was explicitly the force behind bands like the Chemical Brothers, The Prodigy, or Underworld. No, in 1966, the Beatles were first of all committed to more live concerts in Japan, the Philippines, and finally, back in the USA. The Japanese possibly went a little over the top. There had been protests and public demonstrations because the Beatles were supposed to play in what for many people was a holy place, the Nippon Budokan Arena, which was reserved for traditional Japanese martial arts. It wasn't only the Beatles who asked whether 35,000 policemen were really necessary to ensure the security of the 4 Liverpool stars, however. The band was properly locked up inside the Tokyo Hilton Hotel. If anyone wanted to buy a souvenir, a specially selected trader was sent directly up to the suite on the 18th floor. No one was allowed to set foot outside the door, but one morning at 7 o'clock, John managed to leave the building unnoticed. After they had captured him again, the police threatened him, saying that if he did it again, they would withdraw all the security teams and the Beatles would be left on their own. But the Japanese were willing to turn a blind eye. Unlike the Filipino police, you didn't break an appointment off with the First Lady, Imelda Marcos, without paying a heavy price. The female dictator invited the Beatles to eat with her whole family on the 4th of July at 11 a.m. But the Beatles had already politely declined an invitation to a 3 p.m. meeting, and as they didn't read the newspapers, John, Paul, George and Ringo did not know about the morning invitation. They were still asleep when the Filipino TV cameras were directed on 4 empty places at the presidential table, crying children and an acutely embarrassed dictator. The local promoter had simply ignored the appointment. It was too late for an apology. The Beatles were not paid and had to get to the airport without any security. Outraged Filipinos attacked the Beatles in front of the Hilton Hotel, shouting and kicking. The escalators at the airport were turned off, so that the Beatles had to haul their luggage in front of around 200 demonstrators. When, after much toing and froing, the Beatles were finally sitting in the British Airways plane, it felt like a piece of home. Paul later described how he was so overjoyed that he had kissed the seats of the plane. It was John Lennon who said that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus Christ. In an interview with the London Evening Standard, he made the remark in passing, and initially no one really took any notice. The interview was months old and had largely been forgotten when a US teenage magazine quoted Lennon's words, "Christianity will go, it will vanish and shrink. I needn't argue about that. I'm right, and I'll be proved right. We're more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity. In the USA, all hell broke loose. The same fanaticism which had once greeted the Liverpool stars at airports now led to record burnings and self-censorship by radio stations which stopped playing the Beatles. Besides the fact that some of the broadcasters had never played Beatles songs anyway, most teenagers just went out and bought new copies of their newly burned records. But Brian Epstein did consider cancelling the upcoming Beatles tour. The most interesting thing about the US tour were the questions which the Beatles were asked, which this time at least were not focused on hairstyles, wedding dates or menus, but rather on John's blasphemous remark, as the US journalists referred to his quote. Lennon eventually apologized for the sake of some peace, but ultra-conservatives and racists like the Ku Klux Klan were not going to leave him in peace. They marched in front of concert halls and made public threats about appropriate measures. There was an anonymous call threatening an attack in Memphis, and when a firecracker went off somewhere during the gig, all four got the message. Enough was enough. That was it. At about 10 p.m. in San Francisco's Candlestick Park, the Beatles concluded their last of around 1,400 concerts with Long Tall Sally. The history of the Fab Four could probably have ended here. The Beatles would still have gone down in history as the greatest pop phenomenon of all time. In late summer 1966, the British press speculated that the group had split up. Brian Epstein denied it as well as he could, but even he didn't have an answer about the future of the band. Severe depression ensued. His four boys first did all the things that they couldn't do as part of the band. John shot the film How I Won the War in Spain with Richard Lester. Paul composed a second-rate soundtrack for a third-rate film called The Family Way. Ringo went on outings to the countryside, and George meditated in India. Were the Beatles still a real band now that they were not doing live performances? Possibly not. But they were still the Beatles. Biographer Mark Lewison ascribed an equally revolutionary role to the Beatles in 1967 as their transformation of the British music scene in 1963. And he's right. The double single, Strawberry Fields Forever, Penny Lane, from February 1967, pointed to nothing less than the future of pop music. The studio changed from being a simple recording place into a playground, and the end product, the record, became more important than the artists themselves. Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane are essentially simple songs. Created on acoustic guitar and piano, it is largely their dramatic treatment which was responsible for the excitement in the mid-60s, not the songs themselves. The Beatles had already experimented a bit, but John's song about the garden of a Salvation Army's home in Liverpool turned into a surreal sound mix, which, after 55 versions, through ever new attempts at composition and editing, in the end has little left to suggest the performance of a rock band. The 4-track recording is at the core of the piece. If 4 instruments, voices or noises were recorded, they had to be copied onto a single tape to make room for the subsequent parts. Then the same process is repeated. The rule is only 4 tracks at the same time. Without a master like George Martin at the controls of the mixing desk, you would have ended up with an undefinable jumble of noise after, let's say, the 5th copying. To produce the no less tricky and yet clear as a bell Penny Lane next to the unsettling Strawberry Fields, given the technical situation, is a masterful achievement to which producers of all genres still raise their hats to this day. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band can rightly be described as the mother of all LPs. It doesn't matter whether you like the Beatles, and if you do like them, whether the songs on it are among your favorites or not. or whether the Beach Boys provided the foundations for Pepper with their album Pet Sounds. All this is immaterial when you think of this album's influence. The band's name was written as a flower arrangement on its double-sided luxury cover, and for the first time it included song lyrics. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band revolutionized the record medium because the album itself was at the fore, and not the individual songs or their respective performers. Pepper takes this a step further than the Strawberry Fields Penny Lane single. It is often referred to as a concept album, although, apart from the title song, there's no concept. Art is just what people choose to perceive as art. There are numerous legends surrounding the song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, seeking to address the question of what John could have meant by his bejeweled girl in the sky. The initial letters of the main words in the title are LSD, which to conspiracy theorists suggest that there might be a connection between the song and Lennon's drug addiction. In fact, John's son Julian Lennon was responsible for the lines. Jules painted a picture of his friend Lucy in the nursery in which she was floating in the air surrounded by stars. The young Jules came up with a song title when he was explaining the picture to his father. This version of history has since been more or less confirmed by the housewife Lucy Vodden, who went to nursery with Lennon's youngest son at the age of 3, and can remember Julian being collected by his famous father. Lucy remembers Julian holding the picture of her in his hand. In 2007, the BBC wanted to know why she had never told anyone this before. Lucy said her friends had known about it, but they had always persuaded her that she was wrong, and that the song was about LSD. The heart of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band is without a doubt not the title song or its reprise, but the song positioned right at the end, A Day in the Life. Many critics consider the album's closing track to be the quartet's absolute artistic climax. The fact is that A Day in the Life was the first fragment which the band worked on for their new record, with the exception, of course, of When I'm 64, which Paul had written while still a teenager in Liverpool. A Day in the Life essentially consists of two parts: John's bizarre lyrical main part and Paul's perfectly fitting middle section, where he talks about a missed school bus. Essentially, John shares his associations from reading certain newspaper headlines. The songwriting duo knew about psychedelic effect. I'd love to turn you on. What a line. John and Paul only had to glance at it to know that the BBC would censor the song. But by far the most interesting thing about A Day in the Life is how it came into being. In January 1967, the Beatles could, quite simply, do whatever they wanted. Time and money were immaterial. In order to connect the two separate parts of the song together, they filled a 24-beat pause with the atonal surging of an entire orchestra, whose 40 musicians were paid a total fee of around £367 in order to spend between 8 p.m. and 1 a.m. one evening getting every conceivable note out of their instruments, from the deepest right through to the highest. And the Beatles had an extra request, that the fiddlers should wear clowns' noses with their tails and bow ties. For all its power, the Beatles managed to top even Sgt. Pepper, who, apart from the quartet of the superlative, could provide the musical accompaniment to the first live worldwide BBC transmission, One World. The TV cameras in the EMI studios sent the message, "All you need is love," by satellite to an estimated 350 million spectators. Was singing what were to become probably his most enduring lines as a Beatle, John was chewing gum. Patty Harrison, who George got to know during the filming of A Hard Day's Night and later married, introduced the four Beatles to the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, an Indian guru who was then in Great Britain to promote transcendental meditation. The band, always up for new and unusual things, attended an introductory seminar by the Maharishi in Wales during the last weekend of August in 1967. But the news of a tragic accident abruptly tore the Beatles away from their meditative dreams. Brian Epstein was dead. The manager died from an overdose of drugs in his London flat, aged only 32. The authorities did not suspect suicide. There were too many things to suggest that Brian had big plans and absolutely knew how to enjoy life. But the mental state of the Beatles' creator had been steadily deteriorating. The Beatles had been able to achieve their number one position in the early 60s largely through Brian's business capabilities. But they had no need of a finance and logistics man for the detailed studio work, the day, week, or month-long experimentation with tones and sound patterns. At the time of his death, there was only one more month left on Brian Epstein's 5-year contract with the Beatles. Would the band have renewed it in October 67? The four knew that Brian Epstein was irreplaceable for the Beatles. At first, they did not look for a new manager. The position remained vacant. It was, above all, Paul McCartney who pulled the Beatles out of their lethargy following Brian's death. As later years would show, intensive work was Paul's way of dealing with grief and uncertainty. The Beatles' circumstances may have been to blame for the fact that they overestimated themselves and believed themselves capable of anything, at any time and in any place. The idea for the TV film Magical Mystery Tour may have been good, but the premise that the bands themselves should take on all aspects of its production, from the direction to the film music and even the final editing, was not a good one. On Boxing Day 1967, the British public were presented with 52 strange minutes in black and white. A bus journey with boozing day trippers, psychedelic colour shots of the countryside, which the audience were unfortunately unable to see. John Lennon as a mad waiter and the band in animal costumes. For the first time, the band were mercilessly slated. India was supposed to bring the band some peace. The Maharishi's camp, located in Rishikesh, was like a holiday camp, but for transcendental meditation. Ringo had already had enough after barely 2 weeks. The food in particular made him ill. Paul gave up after a month. John and George stayed for 2 months before turning their back on the Maharishi. All four learned that the guru was, essentially, on a money-making trip. George remained true to Hinduism nonetheless, without connecting his beliefs to a priest. John, on the other hand, immediately devoted 2 whole songs to the Maharishi. Sexy Sadie, the strange song title, was supposed to disguise its addressee. And everybody's got something to hide except for me and my monkey. Come on, it's such a joy. Come on and take it easy. The Indian guru had used these words all too often to try and promote a good mood among his wealthy students in the mornings. Lennon managed to make the lines sound like they were being shouted by a manic serial killer. The Indian trip was good for one thing. It led to an unprecedented songwriting output which, in the opinion of the four musicians, needed to be transcribed and put out on black vinyl immediately. But they were mistaken. Before the White Album appeared, which was officially just called The Beatles, a work which the Beatles themselves had almost forgotten came onto the market, the cartoon Yellow Submarine, produced from the Ringo Gassenhauer text from the Revolver album. Although, when the film was being planned in 1966, Paul in particular had been interested in it and even worked on it. In 1968, it appeared to the group like a relic from the past. The public didn't notice anything. Why would they? 4 songs from the Yellow Submarine soundtrack were completely new, with the exception of the Lennon rocker, Hey Bulldog, from the glorious Sgt. Pepper era. And for the first time on a Beatles album, there were also solo contributions from the producer, George Martin. The classical strings-based soundtrack to Yellow Submarine was written entirely by him. At the premiere of Yellow Submarine, John Lennon was seen in public for the first time with a woman who in the following years would rarely be absent from his side, Yoko Ono. She was John's great love, his support, his muse, and probably the reason why his drug habit did not take on life-threatening proportions. On the other hand, the fact that Yoko never left John alone, even during rehearsals, was a source of tension which, although it did not cause the inner turmoil within the Beatles, certainly did nothing to diminish it. Yoko's commentary, criticism, and suggestions for improving the music were equally unhelpful. In short, the other 3 Beatles were uncomfortable in Yoko's presence, a circumstance which was not so much due to her personally as to the fact that she was just always there. Together with Brian Epstein's absence and the relative flop of the Magical Mystery Tour, it was becoming apparent that the Beatles were not sacred and that they were still only human. The public had no idea at the time that Ringo had walked out in the middle of a recording session, leaving the band for 2 weeks. Although the rehearsals and recording sessions for the White Album continued to be more than difficult, the musical end result was right and carried the Beatles' quality seal with good reason, even if the songs were worked on separately by the individual performers and not the whole band. The White Album had wonderful moments. Helter Skelter, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Happiness is a Warm Gun, the contentious Obla-Di, Obla-Da, and by far the most oblique track in the whole Beatles oeuvre, Revolution No. 9. Although George Martin advised the 4 against bringing out a double LP with a total of 30 songs, the Beatles did not listen to his advice. They had 48 new songs from Rishikesh alone, and the musicians' egos had become too inflated for them to believe that anyone could have done without one of their songs. The White Album, with its plain cover, devoid of decoration, stood in marked contrast to the trend-setting Sgt. Pepper album, an antithesis to the flower power hype which the Beatles themselves had played a part in bringing about through Pepper. The double LP sold incredibly well, selling 2 million copies in its first 2 weeks in the USA alone. The Beatles' world-leading musical standard remained unbroken. This was also shown by the way in which the band managed to achieve an enduring hit with Hey Jude, completely independently of the White Album. Hey Jude was the first release by the Beatles' own company, Apple. Apple was envisaged as much more than just a record company. The Apple stood for art, music, film, fashion, lifestyle, and the wild 60s. Apple had nothing to do with the American computer giant, whose logo only differed from that of the Beatles in that the fruit had a bite out of it. The lawsuit over the logos carried on into the new millennium. The Beatles were lost without Brian Epstein. Apple was losing money, clearly demonstrated by the closure of the Apple boutique in the heart of London just a few months after its opening. In addition to all the wrangling over business matters, the 4 were growing weary of the band itself. Paul had become the clear boss of the Beatles, even if he disputed this. But by Brian Epstein's death at the latest, it was obvious that Paul was far and away the most hard-working and creative member of the Beatles. And he wanted to shake the band out of their lethargy. He thought that the best thing would be for them to do what they were best at, to start appearing live again. The whole band had had a lot of fun making the promotion video for Hey Jude, and so why not do this again on a bigger scale? Paul suggested an hour-long film in an exotic setting, like on a ship or in the middle of the Sahara. An amphitheatre in North Africa was finally chosen as the preferred concert venue. But apart from Paul McCartney, no one was 100% in favour of the project. Even so, the Beatles found a producer for the envisaged TV programme, Dennis O'Dell, who eventually managed at least to get the band to start rehearsals. It wasn't an especially good idea to cart the Beatles off to the Twickenham film studios to rehearse their new material and then to stick a camera in their faces early in the morning, but Dennis O'Dell wanted to get some documentary shots of the group while they were preparing for their still undecided live performance. What he got were mostly bad-tempered, tired musicians who were refusing to cooperate whenever they didn't get their own way. Because he let these 16mm tapes run and run and run, however, they pulled it together somehow or other. On top of everything else, Yoko was always there in the studio too. What the Beatles did in Twickenham wasn't bad at all, but they fell short of the standard achieved on their earlier records. And then there was all the arguing. This time it was George who had had enough after the nth dispute between John and Paul. He left the band and went off to visit his parents for a few days. Without him, the Beatles couldn't get anything else done, and the public had no idea about all this misery. The debate in which George was eventually persuaded to rejoin the band lasted 5 hours. His condition? Enough with all the practice for the single performance, the Beatles should record another album. They still had a bit of song material, and the Twickenham place, that cold, much too brightly lit cage, was over. George wanted to go to the Apple Studios, a venue which belonged to the Beatles and had been set up by a technician friend of theirs called Magic Alex. He promised the group 72 tracks when the world standard stood at 4 or a maximum of 8 tracks. And who needed microphones? Magic Alex preferred sonic force fields. Magic Alex installed vast numbers of tiny speakers throughout the whole mixing room. In the end, it took the Beatles 2 days to get rid of all this stuff from Apple Studios. The new plan was for a full-length film and an album to go with it, called Get Back. And it really wasn't bad. George had the great idea of inviting his friend Billy Preston to the Get Back sessions. A hugely experienced but above all extremely personable keyboarder. And suddenly the Beatles were all sweetness and light again. The good mood immediately made its mark on the music. It's not clear whose idea it was to perform a few of the songs from the Get Back sessions, live and without any advance notice, on the roof of the Apple building in Savile Row. It's unlikely to have been George or Ringo, at least. They weren't keen on the rooftop concert idea at first, but were persuaded into it by John and Paul, and naturally also thought of the concert as stuff for a legend. In retrospect, it was the Four's last group performance. The purpose of the whole thing was, in fact, to give director Michael Lindsay Hogg a nice ending for his unfinished TV documentary. But as nicely as the 42-minute rooftop spectacle turned out, which was stopped by the police because of the noise, the Beatles put the planned Get Back album on ice. The reason was obvious. The Four just didn't have enough material. The Beatles were not lazy when they went their own ways. George released a soundtrack album called Wonderwall Music. John and Yoko experimented with the primal scream, and then called the whole thing Unfinished Music No. 1, Two Virgins. They took the title literally and appeared naked on the front cover. Much worse than the musical stagnation of these first months in '69 were the business developments. They were anything but uncomplicated. Brian Epstein's NEMS company was bought by an investment trust, which took away a crucial aspect of the band's control over their own song catalogue. Shares in the publishing house Northern Songs, who had the rights of all the Lennon and McCartney songs, were sold to the media group ATV without the knowledge of the two composers. When the Beatles tried to buy back the lost shares, it turned out that Paul had already increased his shares in Northern Songs without the others' knowledge. In itself, that was neither illegal nor problematic for the other band members, but it left a bad taste because of the vague suspicion that Paul was trying to feather his own nest. Since none of the four were especially good with money, they needed to start searching for a new manager, or rather administrator. Paul wanted to appoint the company owned by his new in-laws, Eastman and Eastman, the father and brother of his new wife, Linda McCartney. But John, George and Ringo wanted to sign over Apple and a fifth of the income to Alan Klein, a not uncontroversial and somewhat dubious manager who, moreover, and this convinced John especially, looked after the Rolling Stones. For Paul, it was 1 against 3. But in the middle of this tense, heated atmosphere, the Beatles achieved their ultimate masterpiece, the crowning glory of their career. Abbey Road is, from the first clapping to John's Come Together, to Ringo's second deep-sea adventure, Octopus's Garden, right through to Paul's bittersweet The End, a phenomenal, self-contained, and furthermore completely timeless sound document. In summer 1969, McCartney had phoned George Martin and asked him whether they could record a new album. Of course, George Martin had replied, as polite as ever, but only if we do it the way we used to. From a purely musical point of view, Abbey Road even puts Sgt. Pepper in the shade. And the album held a particular honor for George. For the first and only time in the Beatles, the single taken from the album was written by him. George had begun work on Something, a piece which could have been a significant achievement for any composer in the world, as early as the recordings for White Album. At just 26 years old, Something was an achievement which earned George Harrison conversations with everyone from Ray Charles to Frank Sinatra. The latter even said to Paul that Something was his favorite song. "Thanks, Frank," Paul replied, "but the song is by George." As iconic as the title and cover of the album became, the street name and zebra stripes were really there by chance. The album was originally supposed to have been called Everest, and only when they were trying to at least get near the highest mountain on earth for the cover photo did the four think of the pedestrian crossing directly in front of their studio in Abbey Road, City of Westminster, London. From a technical point of view, Abbey Road does not have much to offer, but for all that, there are some distinctive innovations. With this record, the Beatles established the sound of the Moog synthesizer in the world of pop by seamlessly integrating the closet-sized monster into their otherwise handcrafted arrangements. George was responsible for this and was so taken with the possibilities for synthetic sound equipment that he immediately recorded a whole album full of sound snippets on the Moog, Electronic Sound Volume 1. After Abbey Road, the Beatles' time was up. After the band was in the studio together for the last time, on the 20th of August 1969, it was only a matter of time until the official end. Paul had had enough of the Beatles after manager Alan Klein, who the other three had eventually appointed, wanted to hold up the release of his solo album to stop it from appearing at the same time as the film Let It Be. This was nothing more than the Get Back film, which had been shelved, now renamed after Paul's latest piano ballad, Let It Be, which no one knew would one day have a similar status to Yesterday. McCartney was beside himself in the face of Klein's paternalism, even throwing Ringo out of his house when he came to visit him to clear up the situation. But what was John doing? Instead of the regular producer George Martin, he had commissioned the American Phil Spector with reworking the old tapes from the Twickenham studios, without saying anything to Paul. With Spector's so-called wall of sound, Let It Be eventually became an untypical Beatles album, overloaded in places and distinctly average, whose artistic distance from Abbey Road could not have been greater. With the title song, the single Get Back, and Lennon's grandiose Across the Universe, Let It Be does contain moments which justify the band's name being on the front cover. George Martin never really got over Let It Be, however, the first and only Beatles album which had not been produced by him. Paul also felt betrayed in business as well as musical terms. And in any case, he had had enough of John announcing that he was going to quit. In passing, in an interview-style press release accompanying his solo album on the 10th of April 1970, he made the announcement which shocked Beatles fans all over the world. There would be no more Lennon-McCartney songs. The connections between the ex-Beatles remained close, although Lennon and McCartney's relationship couldn't be patched up anymore. John, Paul, George and Ringo never again stood as a foursome on the stage. In 1974, manager Alan Klein was convicted for embezzling royalties. John and Paul saw each other for the last time on the 24th of April, 1976. They were watching an episode of Saturday Night Live on NBC in Lennon's New York apartment, when the moderator suddenly invited them, on camera, to come into the studio. However, they both decided not to go. Paul visited John once more the following day, but Lennon didn't have any time for his former partner that day. From this point on, the Beatles were finally history.
You've heard The Beatles, the audio story, by Thomas Bleskin. Translated from the German by Sheridan Marshall. Read by Tony Sheridan. A Liber audio production, 2012.